Painting highlights with watercolour can be a little tricky, especially because we don't use white paint. Tonal value therefore plays an important part of the process, so if you'd like to know how to paint this juicy blackberry with watercolour to level up your painting, then stick around. After attaching my paper to my board like this, I've done a simple outline of the blackberry. We have a line drawing and a reference photograph to accompany this tutorial, and I'll tell you a little later on in this video how you can obtain them for free. So the paints that I'm using today are all by Mungyo, and I will list them in the description box underneath this video, but please use whichever colours that you have within your own kit. You'll probably find something very similar within your own set of paints. So the brushes that I'm going to be using, these are spotters which have a shorter bristle, and I find that they make the application of paint a little bit easier. So with everything in place, we're good to go. This is the colour chart that I use to match my colours, and I'll put a link to this in the description box below as well as on your screen right now. And this helps me match the colours from the photograph. It just makes the job super easy. I begin by mixing ultramarine and indigo to a really watery consistency. This is going to be the colour of the highlight, and we can take this colour all over the blackberry like this. You can see from the line drawing that I've gently penciled in the shapes of the highlights so that when I apply the darker colours later, I have a rough idea of where I'm going. So this colour can be applied all over the pencil lines, apart from the rose-coloured buds, the rose-coloured elements of the blackberry, but this can go pretty much everywhere like this. If you're using a cold pressed paper, as I am, you'll probably find that you'll need to add a little bit more water as you go through because it absorbs the water really quickly. If you're using, say, a mixed media paper or a hot press paper which is smooth, then you'll probably need to add a little less water to blend it as you work through the tutorial. I've chosen to work in a cold pressed paper today because I find that when you build up the darker colours later on, it just makes it a little bit easier to work with, but use what you prefer. By the way, if you are interested in knowing about the different types of watercolour paper, I have done a separate video and I will put it on your screen right now, and I'll also link it in the description. Now, I highly recommend that you watch this video all the way through, particularly so if you're new to watercolour painting. You can get sort of stuck in that tricky stage where you think that your painting is wrong, but trust me, it really isn't, and it's meant to look a little bit disjointed as you work through. So I highly recommend that you watch this video all the way through so that you can see the transformation happen in front of your eyes. So once we've done our base tone, I'm just turning my attention to the stalk and the sepals of the blackberry. We're just going to make sure that the base wash is dry before we apply any more colour, so this is a good opportunity to add some detail here. I'm mixing Naples with a little bit of deep phthalo green to a watery consistency, as you can see, and I'm applying this all over the stalk. This will also be applied onto the sepals. Once everything is dry, I've mixed a thicker mix of indigo, and I'm applying this in smaller sections using a No. 2 size spotter, as you can see. Keeping away from the highlights that I've penciled in and then blending it through with a damp brush. It's really important that the paint is gently blended into the existing dry paint to give it a softer edge. And I'll continue doing this as I work through the blackberry, as you can see here. Gently painting around any detail like this. You'll notice that I'm using a damp brush here just to blend this paint into the underlying wash that we applied earlier. Now it's really important that these washes are dry before we apply the next layer, otherwise they will just be wet in wet and you'll lose the definition. So you can see I'm carefully looking at my reference photograph here and just working around the little highlight, blending it into the paper. I mentioned at the beginning of this video that we have a free reference photograph and line drawing that you can have access to. So if you'd like to join our Facebook group, you can have access to the photograph and line drawing there, and I'll put a link in the description box underneath this video. We are a really lovely, fast-growing community, and you can post your finished paintings from our tutorials there and have some feedback from our lovely members. So do consider joining us there. Like I said, I'll put the link in the description box underneath this video so you can come and have a look. I'm just looking at the elements of the blackberry one by one, and I'm just making sure that I keep a little bit of an outside edge on some of these little berries, I guess you call them. I think they have a name. If you know the name of these little round what I call berries, then do drop it in the comments below. We'll call them berries for the sake of this tutorial. You'll notice that around the outside of them there's a little blurry edge on some of them where the light is reflecting, so it's important that you keep this little gap here and there, and you can see that I've left a gap against the adjoining berry like this. Now don't worry if it looks a little bit stark at this stage. This is perfectly normal and part of the application process. So just carefully working around each highlight. Now remember that the darker that your dark tones are, the brighter that the highlight will look. Because we have this bluey grey tone underneath, you can see that it's almost disappeared now that we've put the darker colour in place. So we may need to address this a little bit later as we work through the painting. If you are enjoying this video, then please consider subscribing. We release new content every Tuesday, so you won't miss out on any tutorials, and you may want to smash that like button. It's a way of letting YouTube know that you're enjoying my content, and it means that I can continue bringing you these videos every single week. Just applying these kind of mid-tones now, as you can see, once again working around those highlights. It's really important that you keep the highlight in place, and I suggest that you work around the highlight in a larger sort of shape so that you have the ability to blend into the highlight itself. So always go a little bit bigger than you think you're going to need so that you have that capacity to blend it into the highlight. So just continuing this process for the mid-tone and blending it through as I go along. So I'm working on this cold press paper because it is one of my favorites to work on. And if you've watched the video that I mentioned earlier on, where I talk about the different types of paper that you can work with in watercolor, you'll know very well that this is one of my favorites. So if you have a favorite watercolor paper that you like, be it textured or smooth or even mixed media paper, which is another favorite of mine, then do drop it in the comments below. I always like to know what people like to work with or what you guys like to work with, so do drop it in the comments underneath this video. So I've mixed Rose Madder and I'm applying it in a stronger tone around the little highlight in the same way that I've done for the indigo tone that we had on the palette earlier on. You'll notice that I've got various puddles of paint on my palette, including just a puddle of water. The reason I do this is because if I use the glass of water, you can add too much water to your brush. By having a small amount of water on your palette like this, you just get the correct amount of water on your brush, just making it super easy to blend. So there's a little pro tip for you there. So now that the paint has dried, I'm just going over everything with plain water with my number 6 size spotter brush, which is a really soft brush, and this will help merge the colours together. By doing this, you're actually taking out a little bit of the highlights, so use a really light touch. You don't want to lose it all together, but it just makes it look a little bit more natural. And so just a light touch and go around everything like this. All we can do then is just leave it to dry, so go and make a cup of tea. Making sure that everything is now dry, I've cleaned down my palette and I'm going to mix burnt umber with a little bit of the, I think indigo, burnt umber and indigo, and we can start to put in the, now I really don't know what they're called. We'll call them the whiskery bits. We'll put in the wispy bits in. So, and also the top of the sepals like this. So we can start to put these grey tones in. So I've mixed burnt umber with burnt umber with a little bit of indigo to a really watery consistency to apply to the top of the sepals like this. Just looking at my reference photograph to see the depth of colour that is needed, and also on these strange little wiry looking parts of the berry. To those of you that know the parts of the berry, I'm sorry if I'm embarrassing myself, do drop it in the comments underneath the video to tell me the names of these parts. So just applying the first wash to these now, and this needs to be reasonably watery, but you don't want it to be too sort of weak because it will be difficult to apply to these smaller areas like this. Now, if you're enjoying this tutorial and you'd like to know a little bit more about botanical painting, we do have a Patreon site with a few different tier levels that you can choose from. If you don't know about Patreon, it's a membership platform. You pay a subscription every month and I will give you different tutorials as a reward. It's also a really good way to level up your watercolor painting if you're serious about watercolor, and also a really good way to help you support my channel. So do take a look at that, and once again I will link in the description underneath this video. So continuing with the process by adding the burnt umber mix to these little areas here, and just continuing until we've covered them all with the first wash. everything's in place, so I've mixed the same mix as before, only this time I've let it dry a little bit on the palette so that I have more control. So I'm using it's actually a number 2 size spotter, but this one's a different brand, so it's slightly thinner. I would say if you're going to use a number 2, make sure that it's got a really fine point, or maybe go down to a size 0 at this stage. So you want to be now putting in a little bit more detail around these areas that we've painted in, and sharpen up any of those untidy edges like this with the indigo mix. The reason I've let the paint dry a little bit on the palette is because it gives you a little bit more control. If the paint was too watery and too wet at this point, it would mean that you would lose control of your paint, but you can see yet again I have my little water puddle at the top there to help me blend it into the existing layers like this. And you can see that the little gaps that we left between the berries really stands out now, and it means that it shows the viewer that the berry has a 3-dimensional form. If we had taken that paint right up to the edge, it would just look flat. So try to keep away from those little shiny areas, the disappearing edge if you like, that is on each of these little berries. So just keep out of that highlight as you work through if you can. So I'm really just continuing the process here for this next stage, where I'm applying the midtones again and just enhancing and building up the midtone into the light tone that we applied earlier on. Just taking great care and looking at the reference photograph to see the bits that I need to enhance like this. So for this tutorial we are using both wet in wet and wet in dry application methods. So you can see already that by building up your tonal values and your tonal variation can make your painting look really 3-dimensional. We have quite a lot of work to do on this blackberry, but you can see already that it's beginning to jump off the page with the tonal values and tonal variations that we have. So by adding those darker values to the base of each berry, it really makes it sort of jump off the page. So I'm just going to continue this process all over the berry. So the berry is now dry and we can switch our attention back to the sepals and the stem. So I've mixed the same colours as before. We have Naples Yellow and Deep Phthalo Green, Naples Yellow at the top, and the bottom colour is burnt umber with indigo. So we have a kind of browny tone there as well. I've also added a tiny bit of Naples Yellow. So Naples Yellow, Deep Phthalo Green with Naples Yellow, and Ultramarine, Naples Yellow, and also Indigo at the bottom. So once again, looking at your reference photograph, just be careful where you apply this colour. You don't want to take it all over the stem. So small strokes here using a number 2 or number 0 size brush depending on the brand that you have, and I'm just using a sort of stippling motion to create a little bit of texture. I've applied some water to the stem on the left hand side only, and I've dropped in the colour like this. So we're working kind of wet in wet, but don't take the water all over, because wherever you put the water, that paint will spread. You just want to apply the water to the left hand side like this, and you can see by using a stippling motion, by patting my brush onto the paper, it looks like we have a little bit of texture. So we really are starting to apply texture with watercolour here. We've already got our gloss on our blackberry, so now we want a little bit of fuzzy texture on the stalk like this. So painting texture with watercolour is actually really easy. I think it's one of these things that people think is quite difficult to do, but all it is different brush strokes, and you can see how simple this is. Making really light work of this painting just by adding the water first of all and dropping in that colour with the tip of the brush. You're letting the paper do the hard work for you, and just pushing the paint in tiny little brush strokes like this to create the illusion of fine hairs or on the outside of this stem. Again, the cold pressed paper just makes this very, very easy to do, and I think it wouldn't work quite as well with a hot press. It just makes it a little bit easier. That's just my opinion. You may find that by using a smoother paper it works better for you. Perhaps it's the application methods that I use. So just following this process by adding the water and dropping in the paint in really small measures. So at this stage, a lot of the paint work is repetitive, so we've still got quite a bit of work to do, but I'll stop talking for a little while and I'll let you listen to some music, and I will speak to you a little later on in this video. Once again, now that everything's completely dry, I've mixed darker values. So we have indigo on its own, and we also have a puddle of the rose madder. I've also got a tiny bit of burnt umber at the top of my palette, and I've added it to the rose madder just to give it a little bit of a more browny tone here and there. So now I'm adding the indigo to the sort of inside area of the berries and blending it once again into the existing layers that we've applied. If you're using a smooth paper, you may find that at this stage, if you've added your paint a little too thickly, that it could go a little bit sticky. So be careful. Because I've used a cold pressed paper, this is the element that I find really easy, and why the cold pressed paper is a lot more forgiving than, say, a mixed media or even a hot pressed. So I'm applying this where I feel the darker values are needed to help those little highlights pop off the page. And you can see that by adding this darker value, the highlights are really beginning to shine again. So once again, it really is a case of repeating the process, looking at your reference photograph and blending out those colours until you're happy with the depth of colour that you've achieved.